To begin our recap, we can remember that Goffman is continuing the legacy of Cooley and Mead. So we're looking at the American social thought, middle years, being continued in Goffman's theory. And again, Goffman is somewhere in the middle between contemporary social thought and the very end of the middle year social thought. And we can see how Goffman continues the legacy of Cooley and Mead by his attention given to the micro level analysis, looking at how people think and how they act in response to macro level forces. So specifically, those macro level forces, these social structures we'll be talking about include culture that tells us if we're normal or not, and different group settings that shape kind of how we think and how we act. So Goffman looks at how we have agency in response to those structural forces. We can recognize if we're normal or not in a given situation, and we can have our free will to kind of interact in different ways in such situations where we need to practice stigma management. And again, we can say he continues the legacy of Cooley and Mead by looking at how psychological tension shapes interaction. So, specifically, we'll look at how psychological tension, mainly negative emotions such as embarrassment and feeling ashamed, drive the action in the framework. Again, the action being stigma management. Continuing our recap, we can look again at Goffman's thesis, his main argument that he's laying out and supporting throughout the book. Goffman believes that people can't always meet normative expectations. So every once in a while, or perhaps frequently, we don't meet the norm, and we don't meet the norm what's perceived to be a negative direction, where basically people expect us to be one way, but we fall below those expectations. So because we can't always meet the norm in the situation, we learn stigma management. So we learn how to manage our stigma in these situations where we could be seen as um, inferior compared to others. People may judge us in a very negative way. So we learn stigma management, and again, we do the stigma management to avoid negative emotions. So we don't want to feel embarrassed, we don't want to feel ashamed. So we learn how to manage our stigma in social situations, specifically those mixed contact situations that we'll talk about shortly. So overall, maybe we can't relate to the examples that Goffman uses throughout his book, but we can probably all think back to, one situation or another where we can relate to, trying to hide some information, trying to deal with some information about ourselves, and we do this, management techniques to avoid feeling ashamed, to avoid feeling embarrassed. So that's why I like about this book a lot. So, maybe you can't relate to the life of a prostitute or the drug addict, but nevertheless, we can relate to situations that he talks about in one way or another. During our last class, we really focused on uh, breaking down Goffman's key concepts, what they mean, and how they relate to one another. And so the first concept we broke down was that of the stigmatized individual. So we talked about how people, when we walk into a social situation, we possess two different identities. The virtual identity, which is who people expect us to be, and we possess an actual identity, who we really are. Usually the two match. Who people believe we'll be is pretty close to who we actually are. And again, who people believe we're going to be is based upon kind of the norm of the situation. So, in other words, if you go to a concert and you see somebody on stage, you expect that they'll be able to perform properly. Nobody's going to be on stage if they don't know how to sing or they don't know how to play guitar. So we just assume that they're going to be able to do what they're doing. And the same thing, again, as we talked about with a teacher. You walk into a classroom, the first day of class, you expect the teacher to be more or less kind of a normal teacher, as somebody who can teach effectively. They may go above your expectations, where you kind of reward them with higher status, but sometimes who we think they're going to be, the virtual identity, isn't who they actually are. So the teacher can't teach very well, the singer can't sing. So it's when the person does not live up to the expectations others put on them, that's when a stigma can emerge. There's a negative mismatch between who we think somebody's going to be and who they really are. And we talked about three different types of stigma. So the three different stigma categories we talked about: the body stigma, which relates to physical differences such as one's height, weight, skin complexion; character stigmas, one's kind of personal differences. So if you're a cheat, if you're a liar, if you have some type of addiction or some type of mental health issue, people could use those differences and stigmatize you as a result. And then tribal stigmas, basically the social groups to which you belong. And so groups such as religion, race, so on and so on. So that's how we can recognize the stigmatized. And in relation to the stigmatized, we have the normals. And Goffman says normals are simply people who have matching virtual and actual identities. Basically, they are who we think they're going to be. And normals, according to Goffman, they have different theories, he calls them, different perspectives of those who carry stigmas in a social situation. So, in other words, if somebody, can't teach well, or somebody can't sing well, we'll see that kind of negative direction, that falling below expectations, and we'll look down on them as a result. So we'll make fun of the singer on stage who can't sing. We'll tell other students about the teacher who can't teach to stay away from them. Perhaps you'll make fun of the teacher behind his or her back. And so you kind of see their difference, not simply as a difference, but you use that difference to kind of see them as being inferior, see them as being flawed in a way. And because the stigmatized individual kind of knows that you'll be looking down on them, when the negative difference emerges, they try to manage that stigma. And so this is what Goffman's really looking at. People know that if my stigma is revealed or if my stigma is seen, they're going to kind of look down on me or look at me as being kind of different in a negative way. So that trying to avoid those negative emotions that come with people treating you as inferior, people treating you as different. We do the stigma management techniques. And so Goffman's context of interest is the mixed contact situation. And basically, the mixed contact situation is when the stigmatized and the normals interact with one another. Goffman says there's potentially other situations, other contexts, when people interact with their own, people who share the stigma Goffman considers to be their own, and also people who are wise, people who have a special insight into the stigma. And as a result of having that special insight, you don't treat them in a negative way. You don't see them as being inferior to you. So typically, the wise would be professionals who work in psychology, psychiatry, social work, counseling. The wise can also include friends and family member who kind of just know you for you and don't see your difference as a personal flaw. And so Goffman's not really interested in when people interact with their own and when people interact with the wise. But he does tell the reader that when this occurs, there is no stigma management going on. You're not trying to manage your stigma because the own and the wise are not looking down on you. That would cause the embarrassment, that would cause feeling ashamed, that promotes the stigma management to begin with. So throughout the rest of the book, Goffman looks at the mixed contact situation when the stigmatized in the normal get together in social situations. So, looking at the conceptual map overview, this information includes, a lot of what I just talked about in the previous slide. Um, People are stigmatized based upon a situation. So, in some situations, one person can be perfectly normal. You are who people expect you to be. But in other situations, you may not match that norm in a negative way. Thus, you'll be stigmatized. So, the stigma is not a permanent fixture of an individual. A stigma is a part of a situation and how people relate to that situation in terms of meeting the norm or perhaps not meeting the norm. So Goffman says that we have these three different categories of stigma, and here I give the examples. On the first day of class, we expect our classmates to have two thumbs, which relates to the body stigma, to be an honest person. Uh, this relates to the character stigma, and to not be a devil worshiper, which would relate to a tribal stigma. And if somebody kind of deviates from this norm in a negative direction, a person has no thumbs, the person is a cheat, or the person does worship the devil, then the classmates, the normals, will apply stigma theories and see the person in a negative way. You worship the devil, so you must be a person who lacks morals and morality. You're a cheat, so you probably or nobody probably can believe you on anything. You're not an honest person. So again, you're kind of seen as somebody who's different, but seen as somebody who's different in a negative, flawed sense. And so we'll now kind of move into the next part of Goffman's book, the section that you should have read for today. So, beginning the new section, we can stop here for a second and kind of recognize that what we've talked about so far, what you've read about, you can start to see it in relation to your first paper. And so, in the first paper, we talk about the driving force behind the construction of reality. And I'm asking you to basically identify for Goffman what drives the action in the framework. Again, when we say the action, we're talking about what drives the stigma management, what motivates people to manage stigma to begin with. And again, it's that trying to avoid a negative emotion, trying to minimize that psychological tension is what's motivating people to do the stigma management. In other words, if you're not embarrassed, if you're not ashamed, for being a devil worshiper or for being a cheat, then you're not going to do stigma management at all because you're not going to feel ashamed, you're not going to feel embarrassed, so you're not motivated to do any managing of your stigma. But for the most part, people will try to avoid these negative emotions because we do have a little bit of shame in our game. So Goffman really concentrates on the driving force being those negative emotions and how we try to avoid them when possible. When looking at key social structures, again, social structures are any social forces that are larger than the individual, such as one's individual status, whether it be our class or our race, um, the group to which one belongs, a situation in which we find ourselves, culture, institutions, all these things are social structures that can shape life. So for Goffman, we can really identify from the get-go that culture is going to be a key social structure because it's culture that basically provides us normative expectations. People will use to kind of measure us as being normal or not. And so we don't get to decide if we're normal or not. It's the culture of the situation that dictates our normality, again, if we're normal or not. And so also groups are going to be an important social structure for Goffman because, again, if we're with our own, if we're with the wise, we're not going to try to manage stigma, but if you're with the normals in a mixed contact situation, according to that group setting, we will employ stigma management. So again, the group operates as a social structure because it influences kind of how we think, it influences how we act. And so we can also see elements of agency being revealed in Goffman at this point. Basically, the agency is, we are aware of our situation. So again, we are thinking people. We kind of analyze, we contemplate, and we kind of think about who we are in relation to our situation. Sometimes we do this consciously, but more often than not, it operates on a very unconscious level. But nevertheless, it is occurring. So Goffman says, we have this agency because we have the ability to recognize if we fit in or if we don't fit in a situation. And then in addition to that, we can say that, people also kind of recognize that the stigma management needs to be done, or if it does not to, or if you do not have to do it. In other words, we recognize that yes, we may have this difference, but we're with our own. Or perhaps, yes, I do have this difference about me, but I'm with the wise. So I don't need to practice stigma management. On the other hand, we can recognize that, oh, I'm in a mixed context situation, I'm with normals, I do need to practice the stigma management. So, kind of being aware of our what I call cultural positioning, am I normal or not in this situation, and recognizing if I do need to do the stigma management. These two aspects capture Goffman's focus on agency. Now, specifically getting into the new section of the book that you read for today, what Goffman is doing is turning his attention specifically to the stigmatized. So while the normals may be there kind of in the background a little bit, for the most part, Goffman now focuses solely on the stigmatized, those who can't meet the norm in what's perceived to be a negative way. And so Goffman says we can look at the stigmatized individual and actually break the stigmatized into two different groups. And he calls these groups the discredited and the discreditable. And so the main way we can separate the discredited person from a discreditable person is by focusing on the visibility of the stigma. Is the stigma easily seen or not? And by focusing on, is the stigma known? Do people know about it? Is the cat already out of the bag? Or perhaps people don't know about it, so the cat is still in the bag. Here we can look at the two, what we can call subgroups of the stigmatized, the two groups of stigmatized individuals, the discredited and discreditable, and basically begin to understand how we can separate them. So first we can start by looking at the discredited. The discredited is a person who has a stigma that's easily seen. And the stigma is visible, or perhaps the stigma is known. So maybe you can't see somebody that visibly, you can't see somebody as a cheat, but you do know the information about them. You saw it firsthand, or perhaps somebody told you about the person being a cheat. So if you can see the stigma, or if the stigma is known about a person, then this person would be called a discredited individual. And the stigma management goal for the discredited person is to minimize tension in the situation, trying to make a situation less awkward for everybody involved, for the person individually, but also for the people in the situation around them, the normals. And so they try to achieve this goal of minimizing tension in a situation by being direct. So we can just address the situation, address the elephant in the room directly. And this could, I'll have examples in the next slide about it, but jumping ahead a slide, You could tell people that, yes, I don't have a nose, and you can see that, so I'm already discredited, but because I don't have a nose, don't look at me differently, I'm okay with it, and it shouldn't bother you if it doesn't bother me. So by kind of addressing the situation, you kind of calm people down, and people won't feel awkward, and you won't feel that people are kind of being awkward, so you don't feel awkward as well. uh, Tension, awkwardness often is contagious in the sense that if one person feels timid, people around that person start to feel a little bit timid as well, for an example. So people can also use covering. And so covering is when you try to lessen the visibility of your stigma. So if you don't if you don't have a nose, you wear some type of facial mask that will kind of cover up your lack of a nose. And so there you kind of lessen the tension of the situation because people are not going to be staring at you so much, and people won't be able to see kind of that stigma sign as much. So it'd be kind of lessening the tension in a way by lessening the visibility of the stigma. And often the discredited, to minimize tension in a situation, will use humor. They'll make a joke about the difference. So yes, I don't have a nose, but I'll make a joke about being able to smell or maybe not being able to smell. So, as I talked about in the next slide, you could use humor to minimize tension in a situation by saying, you know, it smells like manure in here. And the joke would be, you can't smell. And everybody would kind of get the joke. How would you know if it smells like manure if you can't smell? And so everybody kind of has a little bit of a chuckle. And with that, people say, well, this person's not bothered by their difference, so I shouldn't care about it as well. So turning our attention to the discreditable, these are people that you can't easily see their stigma. And the stigma is not known. So, for example, if you are a cheat, people can't see that. Then, if people don't know that about you, you can hide from them. You can hide that stigma from people. And so, here, the stigma management goal, rather than trying to minimize tension in a situation, in the mixed contact situation, the discreditable person tries to pass as normal. So basically, they try to hide their stigma and come across as a normal person. And to achieve this goal as passing as normal, the discreditable person uses what we'll call information control methods. Basically, trying to keep the secret, trying to keep the information unknown, methods to try to keep the cat in the bag. We can further analyze the two groups of stigmatized individuals by first focusing on the discredited. So, as I say, the discredited person is likely tied to the physical body stigma category because more often than not, this type of stigma can be seen and is easily visible. Now, that's not always going to be the case, but for the most part, we can say that, relatively speaking, the discredited person may have the body stigma type. But we can also recognize that once information is known about your stigma, that makes you discredited. So it can also be the character stigma or the tribal stigma categories. So once people kind of find out about your religion, or once people find out about your flawed character, um, they can't see that, but they know it. So that makes you part of the discredited. And so, again, when the cat's already out of the bag, people know it about you, people can see it. You're not trying to pass as normal because you can't. The information is known. So, what you try to do is manage the tension in the situation, trying to make the situation less awkward, less uncomfortable as possible for you personally, but also for the other people as well. So, to minimize tension, again, you can address the situation directly, kind of address the elephant in the room. You can use a covering to lessen visibility, or you can use a humor, make jokes about it. And when you address the elephant in the room directly or through humor, basically you're trying to pop the tension balloon. When you kind of first walk into the situation, people kind of recognize your difference. So when you address it, you kind of say, okay, everybody's on the same page. We can move past this now. Moving on to the discreditable, we say that the discreditable can be can be somebody related to any of the three stigma categories. Because sometimes, if your stigma does relate to a body stigma, sometimes you can make that invisible. Sometimes you can hide it from visibility. So, although you do have the body stigma, you will be considered discreditable when people can't see it easily or they don't know about it. And again, the character and tribal stigmas can be tied into the discreditable when people don't know your supposed character flaw, or when people don't know your social affiliation to a certain group that would be stigmatized in a given situation. So, again, because the cat's still in the bag, people can't see or don't know about your stigma, the discreditable person, their goal in a mixed contact situation is try to pass as normal, to try to keep the cat in the bag and try to keep all the information unknown. And you do this, you try to achieve this goal by using, again, the information control methods. And I'll talk about these methods specifically in the next slide. But, I'll bring this up later on and when we have our next class. But here we start to see, again, Goffman's focus on human agency, on free will. So we recognize our difference and we try to pass as normal, and we can choose our own way of passing. So you don't have to use the same passing technique. People can try to pass as normal in their own ways. So here again, the culture is a social structure that tells us if we're normal or not. But Goffman highlights agency by saying we can respond to that culture in the ways that we want to. So when we are successful at passing, people just consider us to be normal. But when our attempts to pass as normal are unsuccessful, when the passing as normal techniques do not work, then the discreditable person is switched into the discredited category. The cat is out of the bag. People know this about you, so now you're discredited rather than being discreditable. And so, one little kind of abbreviation I talk about is when the discreditable person uses disclosure, and basically they put their cards on the table and they tell people about their difference. They tell people about their stigma. And so when you do this, again, you're kind of practicing your free will. You're controlling information by telling people rather than people finding out the information about you. And so when you disclose the information, you switch again from the discredited category. You switch from the discreditable category into the discredited category when you disclose that information about you. To conclude this section of the book, what I'm going to do is kind of break down some of those information control methods, the different techniques people will use to try to pass as normal if you're part of the discreditable stigma group. And if we were meeting in class together, what I would have you do is get into small groups and kind of break down each of these methods and kind of talk about what they are and then come up with an example of them. So basically that's what I've done here is try to give you a short understanding of what the information control method is and give you an example of how it could maybe play out in a real life situation. So we can start with Goffman's method he calls concealing stigma signs. So basically, when you try to when you try to conceal a stigma sign, you're trying to hide something that will give your stigma away. So if you're somebody who's addicted to heroin, you leave needle marks, on your body, and if people would see those needle marks, then again the cat would be out of the bag. They would see you as a drug addict. So you can try to conceal the stigma signs by wearing long sleeves, by wearing pants all the time. So the signs, the needle marks that will give you away, are concealed. They're hidden. Or in the slide here, I talk about if you're under the influence of marijuana, often your eyes are going to become bloodshot as a result. And if you have these bloodshot eyes, and then people may kind of see that you're stoned, and thus the cat's out of the bag. But to conceal this, you could use eye drops. You could use Visine or something, and that gets rid of the redness. And when you get rid of the redness, you're concealing that sign that people could use to kind of see you as a stigmatized person. Another method to pass as normal, Goffman says, is by using disidentifiers. And here is basically when you're identifying with something, people wouldn't think of you as being something else. So I use the example of somebody who strongly identifies with Christianity. Somebody goes to um, church, every Sunday, perhaps is heavily involved in their church. You would never imagine that they would be a devil worshiper because they're so strongly identified with Christianity. They kind of threw you off the scent, and they wouldn't think anything otherwise. And so, other examples we could talk about would be maybe, somebody who is an alcoholic. That person could identify with kind of anti-alcohol campaigns. The person could, kind of talk down on people who do use alcohol, but perhaps privately, you indulge in alcohol. So people will never think that you're an alcoholic because all you do is talk about how bad alcohol is for people and society as a whole. You're identifying with something so strongly that people will never think this other thing about you. So you're going to be passing as normal. So we can also divide your world. So basically, here is where, to a certain group of individuals, you let your stigma be known. So you don't try to hide anything. But around other individuals, maybe your coworkers, maybe your friends and family, you try to keep it a secret. So you divide your worlds. In one social world, you can, not try to manage the stigma. Uh, you don't have to try to manage your stigma. But in the other social world, you do try to keep it a secret. You do try to pass as normal. And here I think of the television show Breaking Bad. Not to spoil anything, if you haven't seen the TV show, but Breaking Bad has the main character kind of one part of his life. He's a school teacher, he's a husband, a father, and then in the other aspect of his life, he's a drug manufacturer, he's a drug dealer. So basically, he keeps these worlds separate from each other. So he passes as normal in front of his colleagues at work, his students, and his family. But then he doesn't try to pass as normal around the kind of drug manufacturing, drug dealing community. So another way you can try to pass as normal, according to Goffman, is by substituting signs. And so here, you're not really passing as normal per se, but rather you try to give off a lesser stigma and to replace the real stigma that's there. So the example I use is that, if you tell your teacher, that you can't read well, then your fellow classmates or the teacher, him or herself, may kind of see you in that negative way. What's this person doing in college if they can't read well? And so when the teacher calls on you to talk about what you read for today rather than telling the class, I can't read well, I don't understand what's going on. You give off a lesser stigma, and you say, I lost the book, so here you may be a little bit irresponsible, but you're not somebody who can't read well. Or you may say that, um, I didn't read it for today, and so here again, you may be a little bit irresponsible as a student, but they're not going to stigmatize you as much for being lazy or for being somebody who can't keep track of their materials, compared to how they would stigmatize you if they learn that you can't read well, you're illiterate, and you're a college student. So another technique you can use to pass as normal is using the help of a partner. So basically here, another person helps you pass as normal. And an example I always talk about, or I think of at least, is when I was taking abnormal psychology in college. My professor talked about a colleague of his who was another professor who actually suffered from schizophrenia. The form of schizophrenia that relates to your auditory, meaning kind of what you hear, what you don't hear. And so, anyways, uh, this professor, he was a professional, often found himself in kind of social gatherings, different events, different parties. And his wife would always be with him at these social events, and she would always hold his hand. And so whenever they'd be talking to somebody, and she would squeeze his hand, he knew to respond to the voice. So if he hears a voice and his wife squeezes his hand, he should talk back to it. But if he heard a voice and his wife was not squeezing his hand, then he knew not to respond to those voices. Those voices were only in his head, so don't talk to those voices. So here his wife was helping him pass as normal by telling him to talk by squeezing his hand, or telling him not to talk, don't respond to those voices when she didn't squeeze his hand. So another way he talked about is distancing. This is a popular concept right now. Distancing is basically you try to avoid relationships so people won't learn about your stigma. So, on the one hand, you have to go to work, you have to be around your coworkers during the workday, but you can distance yourself from them, after work, on the weekends, by kind of not going out with them to a happy hour, or not participating in some type of weekend event that a lot of other coworkers are doing. So just the more you kind of separate yourself from people, the less likely that they're going to find out the information about you that you're trying to keep hidden, that you're trying to keep unknown. Thus, you're going to be passing as normal. So, to end, I'll go back to the idea of disclosure. So, when you're disclosing information, basically you're letting the cat out of the bag yourself. You're taking control of the situation by putting your cards on the table. And so, here, basically, once you disclose, you become discredited. You're no longer discreditable because the information is known about you. And I'll talk about why people perhaps would want to use disclosure in the next class period. So maybe we'll come back to conclude Goffman's book. I'll revisit some of the ideas with respect to the book report, but also kind of revisit this idea of disclosure and why people perhaps would be motivated to disclose their stigma rather than try to continue to pass as normal. So I'll leave that there for now, and please, let me know if you have any questions. As always,